Imagine a conflict zone where a local warlord isn't just fighting for territory. He's fighting for control of illicit gold mines, maybe smuggling routes, even human trafficking networks. And what if he's making deals with countries you'd never expect? All to keep the chaos profitable. You probably think peace building is mostly about ending conflicts, right? Simple enough. But what if our traditional approaches are failing precisely because they don't grasp this brutal modern reality of war? Today, we're taking a deep dive into a truly fascinating 5-year project from Chatham House. This massive report argues that interventions designed by international policymakers often fall short. Why? Because they haven't adapted to a world of fluid transnational ties and these economically driven, almost ad hoc alliances. Our mission today is to unpack this complex global landscape. We want to reveal how money, power, and some really surprising alliances are actually fueling conflicts around the world. This deep dive is based on the Chatham House Cross-Border Conflict Evidence Policy and Trends Program, that's XPT for short. Think of XFTEEC as being right at the leading edge of research, trying to map these complex, often hidden, global conflict economies. Their work focuses on really tough, protracted crises, the civil war in Sudan, the Israel-Iran confrontation across the Middle East, the Libyan conflict, things like that. And the core idea really is to follow the money, to truly understand the persistent forces driving these transnational flows of capital, goods, and people. Okay, let's kick things off with a big idea the report introduces: foreign policy multi-alignment. It sounds a bit like jargon, I know, but it's apparently crucial to understanding how conflicts work today. Can you break down what multi-alignment means and why it's so different from, say, the Cold War alliances we might still picture?
Yeah, absolutely. What's really fascinating here is how fundamentally the whole global landscape has shifted. Multi-alignment, well, it essentially means that pragmatic interests, often economic ones, now consistently outweigh those rigid Cold War-style alliances or fixed ideological blocs. So at the state-to-state level, you see middle powers like Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, the UAE. They're cooperating with Western governments on some issues, sure, but then they're actively opposing them on others. It's very fluid. And this transition, it's deeply tied to the erosion of American unipolar power after the Cold War. That era, despite its imperfections, it did tend to keep a lid on many underlying tensions. Now those old patterns of fighting seem to be resurfacing.
Right, so it's not just states playing this game then. How does this multi-alignment idea reshape things for, say, local groups in conflict zones, the ones who often seem quite far removed from high-level diplomacy?
That's a key point. Multi-alignment is also profoundly reshaping how local elites and even armed groups cultivate their foreign relationships. These actors are forming these really pragmatic, adaptive alliances right across the political and ideological spectrum. And this isn't just, a new twist on the old patron-client dynamics. It introduces many, many more variables that any conflict resolution policy has to consider now. They are, as the report puts it, highly transactional and transnational in their outlook. Take someone like Khalifa Haftar in Libya. He openly maintains ties with the US, Russia, and China. His sons are even linked to different foreign powers. It's complex. Or, similarly, in Iraq, you have the populist Shia cleric Muqtada al-Sadr. He embodies a far more intricate web of affiliations than just slapping a simple pro- or anti-Iranian label on him would suggest.
That's a huge shift from how we traditionally think about global power, isn't it? Does this mean the very concept of allies and enemies is, becoming obsolete? Or just much more nuanced?
Yeah.
And what are the real-world consequences for global conflicts themselves?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, this whole shift coincides with a really significant rise in the number, the duration, and the sheer complexity of conflicts. We're talking levels not seen since the Cold War. Consider this. In 2024, there were 61 state-based conflicts globally.
61. Wow.
Yeah, and that's roughly a third more than just a decade earlier, and almost double 74% more than the average between 2000 and 2010.
That's staggering.
It is. The erosion of that U.S. unipolarity, which, maybe previously suppressed hostilities, it really appears to be making peace far more elusive now.
Okay, so the report then shifts gears a bit. It argues that today's conflicts are fueled by something they call self-sustaining geoeconomic ecosystems. That sounds complex. How exactly do these ecosystems operate, and what makes them so crucial?
Right. Imagine a kind of shadowy global web where money is really the only loyalty. That's essentially what these geoeconomic ecosystems are. They're not run by states. They're run by these nimble, profit-driven networks. We're talking institutions, armed groups, businesses, external brokers, all operating completely beyond traditional borders. And the key insight, I think, is that they operate purely on expediency. They form coalitions that no single entity can entirely control. So, to understand why peace building often fails, one really powerful approach is simply to follow the money. Trace the flows of capital, goods, people. This quickly reveals the hidden forces that fuel conflict and, crucially, identifies those who actually benefit from keeping things unstable.
Okay, so it's not just about who's fighting, but who's profiting from the fighting and how those profits actually keep the conflict going. Let's try that. Let's follow the money through some of the report's specific case studies. What did they uncover about, say, the gold trade in Sudan?
The scale of this in Sudan
Yes.
is truly shocking. The gold trade there has become a completely self-sustaining economic ecosystem, fueled by the conflict itself. Armed groups like the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF, this powerful paramilitary group, they've massively scaled up and consolidated control over gold supply chains. They basically turned mining and smuggling into these incredibly lucrative protection markets.
Protection markets, meaning they control access, tax it.
Exactly. The RSF controls several mines. It even has its own company, Al Junaid, and they leverage smuggling networks across Chad, South Sudan, the Central African Republic,
Wow.
all to fund military campaigns and buy weapons, completely bypassing any international scrutiny.
Wow.
So a huge portion of Sudan's gold flows directly into their war chest. And it's not just them. The Sudanese armed forces, the SIF, the official military, they also control gold regions. And they informally devote exports, often funneling them to Egypt, specifically to avoid destinations like the UAE, which is widely believed to support the RSF.
So they're actively trying to cut off the UAE route.
Seems like it. And while the official figures for gold exported to Egypt might look low, I think it was $16 million in 2024, the research suggests over 100 kilograms per day of illicit gold enters Egypt from Sudan.
Per day. Incredible.
Yeah. And what's also critical is that the UAE remains a key destination for both official and illicit Sudanese gold. They received nearly 97% of Sudan's officially reported gold exports in 2024. That's $1.52 billion. They also hold stakes in Sudanese gold mining companies. It's this incredibly intricate web that ensures powerful actors profit directly from the ongoing instability.
Okay, that's a stark picture in Sudan. What about the Iranian oil sector under sanctions? This seems like a prime example of how these ecosystems can adapt to external pressure, right?
It absolutely is. The response of Iran's oil sector to sanctions really highlights how flexible these networks can be, how they enable resistance. Sanctions were aimed at curbing Iran's influence, obviously, but they've only prompted Tehran to develop this highly sophisticated survival strategy. We're talking about a sanctions-busting tanker fleet, alternative financial channels, techniques like spoofing ship locations, all to continue trading fuel.
Spoofing. Like faking their GPS data.
Exactly. And China has become Iran's largest energy market by far. They received over 80% of Iran's oil exports in 2023, and it jumped to 91% in 2024. And the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, and various middlemen, they profit hugely from the price difference between sanctioned oil and international market rates. It creates this incredibly lucrative enterprise that, well, it sustains Iran's economy and strengthens what they call the axis of resistance, ultimately prolonging regional conflict.
And finally, the report looked at migrant smuggling through Libya. How has that become one of these self-sustaining conflict economies?
Well, Libya's conflict, ever since Gaddafi was overthrown, has just transformed its centuries-old trading and migration routes into these massive corridors for illicit economic activity. Armed groups control the key transit routes, the border crossings, the coastal hubs, and they generate significant income from migrant smuggling and human trafficking, especially in areas like Kufra and Seva down south. These revenues are actually so substantial that they even support municipal spending in some places where state funding is limited or non-existent.
So the smuggling money is actually funding local government functions.
In some cases, yes. And while European efforts to curb migration have, at times, maybe reduced the flows, they've inadvertently empowered the very armed actors who exploit these policies for profit. This transactional relationship effectively creates a kind of de facto regulation of people smuggling. It legitimizes these armed groups. And it shifts the dynamic from smuggling being just a symptom of conflict to actually being a mechanism that actively prolongs it.
It sounds like these economic systems are incredibly resilient then. They almost seem to adapt to sanctions or interventions rather than being deterred by them. So what does that tell us about the effectiveness of sanctions as a peace-building tool? It sounds like they might even backfire sometimes.
Precisely. That's a key finding. When an activity is sanctioned, it often doesn't disappear. It simply becomes embedded deeper into informal networks. These networks then shape local economies and power structures in ways that make them incredibly difficult to dismantle later on. There's a striking historical parallel the report mentions: the illicit fuel trucker trade in Iraq under Saddam Hussein's sanctions. That trade persisted long after his fall. And it even contributed to the rise of ISIS as a major economic power later on. It just adapted.
Okay, so if these economic ecosystems are so self-sustaining and adaptable, where do they actually live geographically? The report points to some perhaps surprising places on the map, doesn't it? Tell us a bit more about how geography and political structures are reshaped by these transnational conflicts.
Yeah, this raises a really important question. We often overlook places like borderlands, ports, airports. We think of them as just peripheral transit spaces. But the research shows they are absolutely vital hubs in these globalized conflict economies. They become zones of intense economic exchange, contestation, and often a kind of de facto governance emerges. The report calls them hybrid political orders.
Hybrid political orders, meaning not quite state, not quite non-state.
Exactly. Look at Sudan again. The RSF is strategically positioned along trade routes to Chad, Libya, South Sudan. They're even reported to be flying gold directly out of Darfur airstrips. And the UAE established a field hospital in Amengeras, Chad, right near the Sudan border. Reports suggest arms shipments to the RSF might be facilitated there, alongside the gold trade.
So a hospital becomes a potential logistics hub.
Potentially. For Iran, ports in southern Iran, and also Iraqi ports like Khor al-Zubair, are crucial for its fuel trade. That's where a lot of the ship-to-ship transfers, the fraudulent paperwork, the rebranding happens. And these ports attract all sorts of international actors, Iran-linked groups, Chinese firms, Western firms, all vying for inflows. Yemen's port of Aden is another key nexus. It's used by Iran-allied networks for arms and fuel transfers, but UAE-backed groups and Western firms also operate there. It's crowded. In Libya, its strategic location and those old routes have been totally transformed into illicit corridors. Satellite imagery even shows increased fortifications at checkpoints like Economies, Ilfat, Quay, indicating strong control over vital transit corridors by armed groups. The Libyan Arab Armed Forces, the LAF, Haftar's group, also have military alliances, for example, with Russia for arms deliveries into Benghazi, and ties to Syria, facilitating the movement of migrants and laborers.
That level of interconnectedness spanning so many different locations and actors, it's really incredible.
And what about our traditional idea of states versus non-state actors?
Right.
How does all this affect that understanding?
Well, this raises another important question, this time about state fragmentation. That seems to be a key driver of this multi-alignment phenomenon. Many of these conflict-affected states, Sudan, Libya, Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen, they simply lack centralized authority. So instead, you see armed groups transcending their traditional non-state roles to effectively become de facto political institutions.
They're acting like mini-states.
In many ways, yes. They perform essential governance functions, they regulate trade, ensure some kind of security, administer justice, sometimes even provide social services. This completely blurs the line between state and non-state, and it allows them to pursue their own multi-aligned foreign policies. They cultivate relationships with multiple external actors, whoever offers resources or legitimacy. They're not just mere proxies, they're fully engaged players with their own agendas.
Right, not just puppets. Definitely not. In Sudan, the RSF has built this independent power base replicating governance structures, all funded by gold revenues. They've even signed a political charter in Nairobi, aiming for a parallel government. And they're balancing ties with the UAE, Chad, Ethiopia, Kenya, South Sudan, Uganda. It's a complex diplomatic game. In Iraq, you have Iran-allied Popular Mobilization Forces, the PMF groups. They control crucial industries, bureaucratic positions. They oversee the Iranian origin fuel trade. They benefit financially, hugely. And they can even diverge from Iranian directives when it suits their own domestic agenda, showing pragmatism by, say, engaging with Gulf countries. In Libya, well, with over 400,000 armed men, power is incredibly localized. Malicious control routes, they constantly shift allegiances. This allows foreign actors like Egypt, Russia, Turkey, the UAE to back competing factions. Khalifa Haftar, again, he deftly balances interests from the US, Russia, Egypt, maintaining his autonomy by leveraging his strategic position within this whole transnational conflict ecosystem. Even his family members manage distinct roles and relationships, everything from construction booms to informal fuel trading. It's all intertwined.
Given this incredibly complex, fluid landscape, it really makes you wonder how much of what we thought we knew about peacebuilding is just completely turned on its head. Why have the traditional approaches, diplomacy, sanctions, etc., why have they so frequently yielded unintended or even counterproductive consequences?
Well, the traditional approaches, diplomacy, targeted sanctions, maybe military strikes, They consistently struggle to contain these wars, and it's largely because they primarily engage the formal political elites. They simply fail to address this complex web of multi-aligned backers and these powerful economic incentives driving the conflict. Economic sanctions, for example.
Yeah.
As we discussed, they often don't curb the activity. They just create incredibly lucrative arbitrage opportunities. That benefits those operating in illicit markets, like we saw with Iranian oil.
Right. The price difference becomes the profit margin.
Exactly. And crackdowns on migrant smuggling in Libya, they haven't stopped it. They've arguably empowered the armed actors who profit from those very efforts by controlling the now riskier routes and development aid. Well, it's frequently captured by elites or armed groups before it reaches its intended recipients. What's more, Western foreign policy often remains largely state-centric. Government departments are siloed by country.
Yeah, the Sudan desk, the Lydia desk.
Right, and that hinders coordination. It often leads to prioritizing other strategic interests, maybe trade, migration control, economic growth over actual conflict mitigation. And this isn't just, bureaucratic oversight. It's a deeper issue of priority setting. It reflects how sometimes being seen to do something can lead to these counterproductive short-term measures. The report also highlights a perceived hypocrisy in Western diplomatic postures, especially when you contrast responses to, say, Ukraine versus Gaza. And that, unfortunately, erodes moral authority.
That makes sense. So, if these traditional tools are so often failing, or sometimes even making things worse, what does the report suggest needs to fundamentally change? How can we actually be more effective in this new reality?
Yeah, that's the crucial question. How can we be more effective? The report calls for a much more pragmatic, strategic, and profoundly transnational approach to conflict mitigation. First, it says we need to adapt conflict analysis. We have to move beyond these state-centric methodologies and treat conflict as an interconnected system. That means mapping how all these transnational drivers and participants interact and consciously weighing the trade-offs between competing policy outcomes. Could stabilizing one area inadvertently destabilize another?
Okay, think systemically.
Exactly. Second, pragmatic engagement is key. Continuously engage strategically with both allies and adversaries, recognizing that alliances are fluid, they're transactional now. You need to balance deterrence with dialogue, finding areas of mutual interest, like maybe regional security. Understand that coalitions will shift depending on the specific issue at hand. Third, coordinate transnational analysis. We need to expand and pool analytical expertise across different government departments, especially where conflict intersects with things like illicit financial flows and organized crime. Improve information sharing, even with classified data. Break down those bureaucratic silos we talked about.
Get the financial crime experts talking to the diplomats, talking to the military planners.
Precisely. And critically, we need to recognize the hybrid identities of these armed groups. See them as political and economic players, not just militants or proxies, and find ways to actually engage them, even despite their, proscribed statuses sometimes. Fourth, incentivize transnational initiatives. Shift resource allocation to fund cross-border programs, not just bilateral, country-to-country ones. Maybe establish dedicated task forces or senior officials who oversee multiple countries, specifically to champion these transnational perspectives. And finally, strengthen accountability mechanisms. Peace settlements need robust governance reforms and truly enforceable accountability. It has to go beyond just elite power-sharing deals. This means addressing the underlying power dynamics and recognizing that these conflict economies often have public justifications. They do provide livelihoods for poor communities sometimes. So supporting civil society organizations, local journalists, helping them expose damaging practices and amplify local voices, that can embed accountability and challenge this conflict-driven exploitation from the ground up.
We've covered a lot of ground today. We've taken a fascinating deep dive into how modern conflicts are shaped by this idea of multi-alignment, creating these incredibly resilient, almost self-sustaining geoeconomic ecosystems. We've seen how following the money reveals these intricate networks in the gold trade of Sudan, Iranian oil smuggling, migrant trafficking in Libya. And we've seen how critical roles are played by often overlooked borderlands and these fragmented states where armed groups act almost like governments. I think the big takeaway is that traditional peacebuilding often fails because it's built on perhaps outdated assumptions. It struggles to coordinate across these complex, often contradictory global realities.
Absolutely. This has truly highlighted the urgent need for policymakers to adopt a much more pragmatic, much more transnational approach. It means engaging with all the actors involved, strengthening accountability, and really acknowledging the full spectrum of interests that are at play.
So, as you reflect on all this, maybe consider this provocative thought. If instability itself can be such a potent source of profit and power for so many different actors, what does peace truly look like in that context? And who gets to define it in a world where alliances are constantly shifting and economic interests so often seem to outweigh political loyalties?